There is no doubt. I grew up Ethiopian once upon a time, let's say German back in the day, when Eritrea was part of Ethiopia. But at that time, I grew up being taught that I was Ethiopian, a country that had 3,000 years of freedom, exceptional history in Africa. But as I grew up and started thinking about it, a lot of things were contradictory. They didn't go with the over conclusive and inclusive history of Africa vis-a-vis colonialism. Ladies and gentlemen, I found it very interesting today to discuss exactly what Ethiopia as a nation had been when she was constructed, when she stood independent as such, as a country recognized. When was Ethiopia fully constructed? When was Ethiopia actually came to existence in Africa? Then did
One
it
sec.
really? Was it really like the other Africans, or did it just stay independent by itself for 3,000 years? Where does the 3,000 years of independence come from? Was Ethiopia alone by itself existed in Africa? Regardless, just Ethiopia by itself. Who made the boundaries? When was Ethiopia born? So this discussion, ladies and gentlemen, how can the 3,000 history of Ethiopia as a nation, existing itself alone in Africa, be proven vis-a-vis reality and history? Was Ethiopia standing alone as a country in Africa? Just alone. All these years? Or wouldn't this defy the history of colonialism and the making of nations in Africa altogether? Seriously, a lot of educated Ethiopians believe that story, and it surprises me too much. Do they ask? Do they investigate? Or they just believe it emotionally because they love their country so much? Ladies and gentlemen, let's see how Ethiopia was constructed. We sure know that Africa is composed of some in about 54 or 53 countries. And then they all claim to have been byproduct of colonialism, European colonialism, which started in 1884. The Europeans decided to come to invade Africa divided. And then that era has been considered the beginning of colonialism in Africa. Let's say German, if we check out, now of course many countries live differently. Bounded by the colonial treaties and stuff. But when the Europeans decided in the Berlin Conference to go invade Africa, Africa basically at that time looked like this in 1880. This is prior to the Berlin Conference. Check out now where Ethiopia, how did Ethiopia look like at that time? Did Ethiopia exist as a nation in 1880? Did other African countries exist at that time as nations, as independent nations, bounded nations? Well, the answer obviously is no. The four African countries were bounded after the colonialism of Europeans. If we believe in this, then we go to the next step. When did Ethiopia then came to existence as a nation, as a country? In order to do that, we will have to investigate certain situations here. What we have to recognize here is the neighboring countries to Ethiopia were all colonized, and their colonial territories defined by the colonial powers and native, maybe native citizens of those countries. In regards to Ethiopia, in this situation, if you look at it, we can see that Ethiopia, I think this is a better map, is bounded by Eritrea, by Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, and Eritrea, including Djibouti. Well, history says all these countries were colonized, and they were bounded by colonial treaties, some kind of way. But how did then Ethiopia exist without colonial connection? Is it possible to conclude that Ethiopia, by default logic, was also bounded by colonial treaties applied to its neighboring countries, ladies and gentlemen. This is a very interesting question, and today we will investigate it. Let's see the Sudanese border with Ethiopia. Okay, Sudan was, including South Sudan, a colony of the British Empire. The Britain actually invaded Sudan in the late 1899, and then it stayed there until 1952. 1899 till about 1952, in what is known as Anglo-Egyptian condominium. Sudan gained independence in January 1, 1956, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, but the boundaries of Sudan were formed in 1899. In 1899, when British had full control of the region. Region meaning all the regions in there comprised within the Sudanese national identity, the South Sudan and the North Sudan. So if we go to the map, we can see that the Southern Sudanese and the Sudanese collectively had their borders demarcated with Ethiopia in 1899. Okay, and now we're going to come to Kenya. Britons, they controlled Kenya in 1895. And then after significant resistance by especially the Mau Mau rebellion, Kenya gained independence in 1963. But the boundaries between Kenya and Ethiopia should have been constructed by the local chiefs, Ethiopian local chiefs in that area, and the British English government. I mean, in 1895, I'm talking about in 1895. The the common border between Kenya and Ethiopia should have been constructed by 1895 by the British. And then the Sudanese, of course, 1899. We're only discussing borders with Ethiopia, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, Kenya got independence in 1963. So let's come to Somalia now. Somalia border, of course, there are a lot of issues here because the British had partially colonized Somalia, and then the Italians colonized the other part of Somalia. And basically, at the end of the day, the British combined both of them as a nation, and Somalia gained its independence. After England uniting both under its military, of course, in 1941 until 1949, but in June 26, 1960, United Somalia Republic independence was announced. Therefore, here we're talking about Somalia, Italian occupied Somalia in 1889. Okay, and the British Somalia was established in 1880. So, just about that time, the border between Somalia and Ethiopians was constructed. Of course, probably in different years. The Britons already had part of Somalia in 1889, while the Italians had it in 1880. I mean, share of Somalia, but united, both of them in 1941, and then until 1949 under the Britons, to be liberated in 1960 as a unit, as one country in June 26, 1960. Okay, what does this mean in relation to Ethiopia border? Well, this means the border between Ethiopia and British Somaliland must have been constructed, okay, around 1889, basically. Okay, so we continue to Djibouti, ladies and gentlemen. Djibouti versus France. France established control of Djibouti in 1894, and Djibouti gained independence in June 27, 1977. After national referendum, the people of Djibouti had to do referendum to stay under colonialism or to be independent, I think so. Just exactly like we Eritreans did in 1993. Okay, about 3 years after the country was freed by armed struggle. Okay, after referendum, June 27, 1977, Djibouti was declared independence, and then it became member of the United Nations. But France established control of Djibouti in 1894. But what does this mean? This means the borders between Djibouti and Ethiopia should be constructed at that time in 1894. Okay. Well, the next we have to discuss is Italian-Eritrean connection, because border in the north was signified by this event in history. Ladies and gentlemen, Eritrea and Ethiopia. Okay, Eritrea was completely declared, in a complete sense, declared as part of the Italian Empire in 1890. Therefore, the borders between Ethiopia and Eritrea must have been constructed at that time, of course, making the Treaty of Wuchale in 1899 as a main factor of the agreement at that time, the boundary agreement between Emperor Menelik and Italy. Here and there, in 1890, Eritrea was established as a complete country. So now then, we go to the next phase of the entertainment, historical entertainment. As I always say, I always believed, at least told myself several times, and listened to a lot of intelligent people out there, ladies and gentlemen, historically, a country has to agree with itself. A country has to synchronize with its own history. For example, in Eritrea, 9 nationalities must agree on the national history told by the government. The Eritreans must have the same history, although diversified in culture, in order to coexist peacefully. Then Ethiopians also, as Ethiopia, to exist as Ethiopians under a unit named Ethiopia, they must synchronize with its history. And who was telling the story? Who told this story anyway, the 3,000 years? And why are there about 12 liberation movements now trying to separate from Ethiopia? Because this signifies they don't agree on the history. But let's go. And then let's go to the next topic. When did Ethiopia become a complete country? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if Ethiopia and Sudanese borders were made by the Britons in 1899, that border between Sudan and Ethiopia in the west side of the country must have been established in 1899 by local chiefs in the area. I don't understand, but at least by the Britons, who used to colonize South and North Sudan as a unit. If we go to Kenya and Ethiopia border, Kenya was established in 1895. Well, that time must be the time that Britons constructed the borders between Kenya and Ethiopia. You got Somalia-Ethiopia border, Ethiopia, and then British Somalia as such. That border was established by the Britons in 1880. And the Italian Somalia was established by 1889. For the entire Somalian territory should be constructed boundary-wise in relation to Ethiopia boundary just about that time. You go to Djibouti, Ethiopia border, ladies and gentlemen, 1894 was when France established complete control of Djibouti. So the borders between Djibouti, I think here it's a little bit funny here. If you see Djibouti and Ethiopia, you're talking about Italy in the north and Britain's in the south, considering Somaliland under the control of Britain at that time. So the border between Djibouti and Ethiopia should have been established by those colonial powers, meaning that France was right there, and France had to define its borders with the Britons in Somalia and Italians in north in Eritrea. I would say the borders between Djibouti and Ethiopia to be a function of those three powers that used to colonize the area. Right. Interesting. Because these are historical facts we cannot avoid. I'm saying if the Ethiopian-Sudan border was actually demarcated in 1899, the story is that Ethiopia existed 3,000 years by itself, independent of anybody, it just collapses as a matter of historical fact. If Kenya and Ethiopia's border was established in 1895 as a function of Kenya's falling under the full control of the Britons in 1895. Therefore, the 3,000 Ethiopian rhetoric about its independence falls apart. If we come to Somalia and Ethiopia border, likewise. The Ethiopian-British Somaliland border was established in 1880. There was no Ethiopian borders as such that lasted for 3,000 years, as has been told by many Ethiopian intellectuals. The Ethio-Somali border as such, looking at it, Ethio-Italian and Somaliland, 1889. Therefore, Ethiopian borders beyond this limitation didn't exist for 3,000 years in these areas. And then so does apply to Djibouti-Eritrea border, which took place in 1894. Therefore, the Ethiopia-Djibouti border didn't exist for 3,000 years. Eritrea-Ethiopia border took place in 1890. And thus, we don't know any other Ethiopian history beyond that concerns the Eritrean people. Continue on this discussion, we found out the Sudanese-Ethiopian border being the longest negative differential I'm talking about. And then that Eritrea was fully established in 1890. Eritrea was formed 8 years ahead of Ethiopia as a unit. By historical conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I'm saying Eritrea was already as a nation established in 1890, fully established, while Ethiopia was at least supposed to have been fully organized 8 years later with this kind of historical dynamics. This is very interesting. Then we come also to the conclusion that since Ethiopian borders with their colonized neighbors were established during these years, Ethiopia as a unit never existed. Before the years, the colonial boundaries of the neighboring countries were established with itself. Ethiopian borders were a function of colonial powers in that area. I'm talking about France, Italy, and the Britons. Then the borders were formed in different areas, in the east, in the west, north, and south of Ethiopia, by those powers. Then we can conclude that Ethiopia is a function of colonialism, European colonialism, specifically the colonial powers that are involved in this situation, the French, the Britons, and Italians. That makes Ethiopia a function of colonialism. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Ethiopia couldn't have been constructed without the colonial boundaries, constructed by the colonial powers themselves. Interesting story is that Ethiopia had never been colonized. Ethiopia is only uncolonized nation in Africa because it stayed as a nation for 3,000 years, which is very contradictory to the stories that I discussed today. But has Ethiopia been colonized or not? How do we define colonialism? If colonialism is a process by which a country stays under a foreign power, especially the Europeans, for economic and political reasons. If this is how it was, wasn't Ethiopia colonized in 1935? When the Italians tried to expand their territories from Eritrea, deep south Ethiopia, and Emperor Haile Selassie ran away to save his life as a refugee to Europe in 1936. And then Italians officially annexed Ethiopia as part of the Italian Empire in 1937 until they got defeated by the British army in 1941. So there were about 6 or 7 years, at least 5 years of colonialism, Italian colonialism. Graziani was already in Addis Ababa in 1936, and then sitting down in a palace as the leader of the Ethiopian Empire. Okay? Composed of the bigger Italian Empire. At that time, this was the story. So where do we put those 5, 6 years? If we say Ethiopia was not colonized, then how can we say, what do we say about, how do we read history in terms of those years? At that time, the leader, Haile Selassie, Emperor Haile Selassie, was already in Europe. Okay? As a refugee, running away. And then Ethiopia was under the Italian colonialism, to my understanding, under Graziani. It was already registered as part of the Italian Empire. So here, what I'm saying is the numbers are not as many compared to other African colonized countries. Okay, it's not as, because Italy, for example, colonized Eritrea more than 50 years, and most African countries were colonized for years, for decades. In Ethiopian case, it was 5 or 6 years. But does this mean Ethiopia had never been colonized? Listen, how do we see colonialism? Do we see it in terms of possessing political authority in a certain geographical area, or in terms of years? To me, Ethiopia was colonized for 5, 6 years. To me, this tells me that Africa, all Africans, all of us, 100% were under the experience of European colonialism, despite the time differential. Ethiopia as well was colonized for about 6 years, the shortest period of colonialism in view of other African countries. Africa countries were all byproducts of European colonialism. Nobody demarcated the borders, ladies and gentlemen. It's all byproduct of the European colonizers. Ethiopia, as a complete nation, therefore, should be 125 years. You understand what I'm saying? Since 1899. In this verdict, Ethiopia only existed as itself, as we know it right now, for 125 years. Whereas Eritrea in complete format existed from 2025 minus 1890 for 135 years, ladies and gentlemen, since 1890. Therefore, the nationhood of Eritrea was established beyond of Ethiopia was established. This is what I'm trying to say. Historically, we have to be correct. We have to read our histories correctly. In the meantime, I'd like to mention the Treaty of Uchali, which was signed in 1999 between Emperor Menelik and Italian Eritrea. Government to government, ladies and gentlemen, 1899. Okay, 9 years After Eritrea was established as a nation, it was only agreement for borders, but Italy had already established a nation. Nevertheless, this is all I want to say today. I do believe Ethiopians have to go back and then revise their history vis-a-vis all ethnic groups in the country. I seriously believe the problem in Ethiopia right now, all the divisions, ethnic divisions, and even the Article 39 itself are all the byproduct of falsifications, falsified historical analysis, historically unaligned combination. Okay, one tribe reads it something else, other one does it this and that. And then what is Ethiopia as such? With this kind of luscious historical analysis, how can it combine and unite its people? Because all the tribes have their own stories. Nobody was Ethiopia 125 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, in reality, nobody was. All of us were just living without boundaries. Without boundaries, like 1890, before the Berlin Conference, before the Europeans decided to come to Africa and divide us. Okay, not divide us. We were not actually united to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. Africa was just out there for anybody that could grab it. It was for grabs. The fittest survived in his own community. In his own community, therefore, or in its own community, if we're talking about in terms of society. If we're also talking about in terms of kings, in that king's perspective, how far can a person go without transportation, without planes, without cars, and that is another story to talk about. But all of us Africans were colonized, including Ethiopia, and Ethiopia should correct its history in order to get along with the histories of all the African countries through colonial misjudgment or whatever it is. Of course, the boundaries are not correctly done because there was nothing to correct to begin with. It was selfishness, economic, and then power mongering experience of the Europeans that divided Africans like that. And no African is responsible here. Ladies and gentlemen, we're all victims of this problem. But Africans decided to live within their boundaries, no matter what, and to pacify whatever they need amicably for peaceful confidence, for coexistence. What I mean is the Europeans could have designed to divide Africans in terms of very sensitive calculations. I mean, something that guarantees fighting between tribes. Many tribes have been divided in different countries. And so Ethiopia has to exist, accepting the facts on the ground. Nobody created those countries. Africans didn't create them. The Europeans created them. But Africans decided to live with them. Therefore, Ethiopia's prehistory analysis of its own existence does not exist. Ethiopia never existed 3,000 years ago. Okay? In Africa, Africa existed longer, but Ethiopia existed about 125 years ago. That's when we know, and that's how history is read. If you want to look at it from a realistic point of view, therefore, there is no exceptional history for Ethiopia that Africa delivers. All the Africans, all the countries were produced as a function of colonialism. And this opportunity, I'd like to say again, Ethiopia was relatively fully formed 8 years after the sovereign map of Eritrea was designed and put in the political arena. You understand what I'm saying? Universally speaking, Eritrea is 8 years older than Ethiopia in this session, ladies and gentlemen. And then I will come next time to talk about this kind of things. It fascinates me because you go one layer deeper, you will find history so much. Acceptance without investigation is what's hurting the Ethiopian people. 3,000 years has to be trashed. It doesn't exist. Nobody acknowledges that kind of history in the world, in Africa, in our region. Therefore, I remind my Ethiopian brothers and sisters peacefully, really, reorganize their history and synchronize the history as read by many of the ethnic groups inside the country. I do believe the 10 or 12 liberation movements in Ethiopia are trying to liberate away from this history. They're trying to run away from this history because it doesn't really include, it doesn't make sense to their own histories. It contradicts with their own histories. They don't have this kind of united history. Because of that, Ethiopia has too many tribes divided in terms of identity. And a lot of them have flags, identifying flags. And all the war you see in Ethiopia is because one part of Ethiopia reads the history this way, and another one doesn't care and doesn't agree. And everybody is now trying to liberate itself, every ethnic group. Not every, but about 10 or 11 or 12. They all are liberation movements from where? From Ethiopia. Where is Ethiopia? Which Ethiopia are they trying to separate from? Ladies and gentlemen, the Ethiopian politicians necessarily need historical alignment. Okay? Historical alignment in order to maintain the country as a unit, in order to keep it undivided. All these ethnic groups, all the politicians, all the educated people got to sit down and synchronize their histories. And finally produce one substantial history that represents them all. Because the Ethiopian history, as it is put today, does not represent all the Ethiopians, and that will be one of the most difficult situations to imagine in terms of uniting Ethiopia and keeping it as a nation. Thank you very much for listening.